The world sleeps, or at least most of it does. The sun, a distant memory, has surrendered its watch to the moon, often hidden behind a veil of clouds or a thick blanket of urban light pollution. It is in these hours when the veil between the known and the unknown feels thinnest, when the rational mind is weary and defenses are down, that strange things are said to occur. The dead of night, that liminal space between midnight and dawn, it's a time steeped in primal fear. Our ancestors huddled around fires, knowing that this was when predators, both seen and unseen, roamed freely. That instinctual dread, it lingers within us, even in our modern, well-lit world. We lock our doors, double-check our windows, draw our curtains tight, yet the feeling persists. A prickling on the back of the neck, a sudden chill that has nothing to do with the temperature, the sense of being watched. Tonight, we delve into that darkness. We explore 3 accounts submitted as true experiences from individuals who faced something terrifying during those vulnerable late-night hours. These are not tales of elaborate hauntings or cinematic monsters. They are accounts of subtle intrusions, unnerving encounters, and inexplicable events that shattered the peace of the night and left a lasting scar. As with all such accounts shared online, we present these stories as experienced and recounted by the individuals themselves. Whether you believe them to be paranormal, psychological, or something else entirely, the fear and the impact they describe are undeniably real to those who lived through them. Prepare yourself. Turn down the lights. Ensure you are alone. And listen closely, for the dead of night is listening back. Our first story comes from a listener named Sarah, who lived alone in a small, older house on the outskirts of a quiet town. The house itself wasn't particularly old or known for any history, but it had that certain character. Old wood floors that creaked with every step, pipes that groaned in the walls, and a tendency to feel drafty even with the windows closed. Sarah was in her late 20s, working remotely, and generally enjoyed the solitude. She wasn't one for ghost stories or superstitions. She was practical, grounded, or at least she had been. The events she described began subtly, as these things often do. It was late autumn, the nights drawing in early, the air crisp and carrying the scent of damp leaves. Sarah had a routine: work until late afternoon, make dinner, maybe read or watch a movie, and then head to bed usually around 11 or midnight. She was a light sleeper, always had been, but she was used to the normal sounds of the house settling: the wind rustling leaves against the windows, the occasional distant siren. The first time she noticed something unusual was about 2 weeks before things escalated. It was just past midnight. She was in bed, drifting off. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels deep and still. And then she heard it, a soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against her bedroom window. Her eyes snapped open. She held her breath, straining to hear over the sudden pounding of her own heart. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, not aggressive. It sounded like a twig, perhaps, blown by the wind. She told herself that. It was just a branch. The old oak tree in her backyard had branches that reached towards the house. Yes, that was it, just the wind. She waited. The tapping stopped. She waited longer. Nothing. She sighed, a quiet release of tension, and tried to relax back into her pillows. Her mind, however, was now fully awake. She found herself listening intently to the silence, her senses on high alert. Every tiny creak of the house seemed amplified. Every distant sound seemed closer. She eventually drifted off, but the sleep was restless. The tapping returned the next night, and the night after that, always late. Always after midnight. Always the same soft, persistent tap, tap, tap against the bedroom window. It wasn't constant. It would last for maybe 30 seconds, stop for a minute or two, and then start again. It was intermittent, just enough to keep her from fully relaxing, just enough to plant a seed of unease. She started checking the window before bed. The latch was secure. The curtains were thick. She even went outside during the day to look at the oak tree. Yes, there were branches close to the window, but none that looked like they could consistently tap against the glass in that specific spot with that specific rhythm. And the wind wasn't always blowing when she heard it. Some nights were completely still. Doubt began to creep in. Was it an animal? A bird? Unlikely at this hour, in the darkness. A small animal? It felt deliberate, too evenly spaced. She started leaving a light on in the hallway. It didn't stop the tapping. She tried ignoring it, burying her head under the covers. But the sound seemed to penetrate the duvet. A persistent, annoying, and increasingly unsettling reminder that something was outside, right there at her window, in the dead of night. The unease grew into anxiety. Sleep became a battle. She would lie awake for hours, waiting for the sound, dreading it, yet also needing to hear it so she knew where it was. Her imagination, normally quiet, began to work overtime. She pictured a twig, yes, but animated, tapping with malicious intent. Then she pictured something holding the twig, a hand, a pale, thin hand. One night, about a week after the tapping started, the sound changed. It was around 2 a.m. The house was silent. Sarah was wide awake, staring at the ceiling, mentally cataloging every creak and groan. Then came a new sound. It wasn't tapping, it was a scrape. Screech, stop. Screech. It was low, resonant, and undeniably coming from the side of the house, specifically near the back door. Her blood ran cold. This wasn't a branch. This wasn't a bird. This was something heavy, being dragged or scraped against the wood siding, or maybe the back porch. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She carefully, slowly got out of bed. Every movement felt deafeningly loud. The floorboards protested her weight. She tiptoed to her bedroom door, opening it just a crack. The hallway light was on, casting long, distorted shadows. She listened. The scraping had stopped. Silence. A heavy, expectant silence. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, frozen, listening. She wanted to call the police. But what would she say? There's a scraping sound outside my house. It sounded ridiculous. She tried to rationalize again. An animal? A raccoon? But the sound was too uniform, too deliberate. It sounded mechanical, yet organic. Like something hard, but uneven, being dragged. She crept down the hallway, towards the back of the house, where the kitchen and back door were. The floor was icy cold beneath her bare feet. Each step was agony, a potential betrayal of her presence. She reached the doorway of the kitchen. It was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind her, casting the room in deep shadows. She could just make out the outline of the back door. She listened again. Nothing. Just the frantic thumping of her own pulse in her ears. She told herself it was over. Whatever it was, it had gone. Just her imagination. Her nerves frayed by days of the incessant tapping. She took a shaky breath, about to turn back towards her bedroom. She yelped, a strangled sound caught in her throat, and stumbled back against the doorframe. The sound was right there, loud, violent, like something heavy and sharp was being dragged across the wood with force. Screech! It stopped. Then came another sound, a low, guttural growl. It wasn't human, not quite. It was deep, ragged, filled with malice. It came from directly outside the back door. Sarah's blood ran to ice. Every rational thought fled her mind. This was real. This was not a branch. This was not an animal. She scrambled backward, half crawling, half stumbling, back down the hallway towards her bedroom. Her legs felt like lead. Her lungs burned. She reached her room, slammed the door shut, and fumbled for the lock. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely turn the small metal knob. Locked. She leaned against the door, gasping for air, tears streaming down her face. Then, the scraping started again. But this time, it wasn't just at the back door. It was everywhere. Screech against the kitchen wall. Screech against the living room window. Screech against the front door. It was moving, rapidly, around the outside of the house. A cacophony of grating, tearing sounds. And mixed with the scraping, she could hear it. The growling, low, constant, sometimes punctuated by something that sounded like heavy breathing, or perhaps a wet snuffling sound. It was circling the house. Whatever it was large, powerful, and it was trying to get in. She backed away from the bedroom door, stumbling towards the far wall. She covered her ears, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to block out the horrific sounds. But they were too loud, too real. The scraping seemed to intensify, becoming more frantic, more aggressive. It sounded like claws, long, sharp claws tearing at the wood, searching for a weakness. She stayed like that for what felt like hours, huddled against the wall, trembling uncontrollably. The sounds continued their terrifying symphony of scraping and growling, circling the house, testing every entry point. She didn't dare move, didn't dare make a sound. She just waited, expecting any second to hear the crash of glass or the splintering of a door frame as it finally broke through. Eventually, slowly, the sounds began to subside. The frantic energy lessened. The scraping became less frequent, the growling more distant, until finally, silence. Complete, absolute silence. the kind of silence that is heavier than any noise, filled with the echo of what came before. Sarah didn't move until the first hint of gray light appeared outside her window. She was stiff, sore, emotionally drained. She hadn't slept. She hadn't even dared to stand up. When the sun was fully up, casting weak light into her room, she finally, cautiously, approached the window. She looked out. There was nothing. No sign of disturbance. No claw marks on the window frame. No broken branches. She then slowly, hesitantly, went to the back door. She examined the frame. The door itself, nothing. No scrapes, no scratches, no damage whatsoever. It was as if the terrifying sounds she had heard had been internal. A nightmare projected onto the reality of the night. But she knew what she had heard. It had been too real, too visceral. The growling. She could still hear it in her mind. She spent the next few days in a state of hypervigilance. She installed extra locks, bought security cameras. She told a friend who tried to be supportive, but suggested it might have been stress or a wild animal she misidentified. Sarah knew they didn't believe her. The tapping at the window never returned, but the scraping, she would sometimes hear it, faintly, distantly, on particularly dark and quiet nights. Or maybe she couldn't be sure. It was just the sound of her own fear, echoing in the silence of the dead of night. She never felt truly safe in that house again. She eventually moved, leaving the quiet town and the house with the old oak tree behind. But she says that even now, years later, the sound of scraping wood or a low, unexpected growl can send her heart rate soaring and transport her instantly back to that terrifying night when something unknown circled her home, testing her defenses, just waiting for the dead of night to claim her. Our second story takes us out of the confines of a home and onto the lonely stretch of highway late at night. This account comes from Mark, a long-haul truck driver, someone well accustomed to being on the road during the hours when most people are asleep. Mark is a practical man, used to dealing with the realities of the road: fatigue, bad weather, mechanical issues. He'd seen strange things, sure. Weird lights in the sky, odd animal behavior, but nothing he couldn't explain away eventually. Until one night, on a particularly desolate stretch of highway. It was about 3 a.m. Mark was driving through a rural area, flat land, fields stretching out for miles on either side. The nearest town was still an hour away. The highway was deserted. Just him, the hum of his engine, and the beam of his headlights cutting through the absolute blackness. He was feeling the usual fatigue that sets in during the graveyard shift, fighting to stay focused, sipping on lukewarm coffee. He was on a long, straight section of road. His eyes scanned the asphalt ahead, the shoulders of the road, the ditches. Habit. Looking out for deer, debris, anything that could be a hazard. That's when he saw it. Far in the distance, maybe half a mile ahead, on the right-hand shoulder of the road. A figure. He blinked, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue? A trick of the light? He focused his gaze. No, it was definitely there, standing still on the side of the highway. at 3 a.m. This immediately struck him as odd. Who would be out here? There were no houses nearby, no rest stops, just fields. As he got closer, his headlights illuminated the figure more clearly. It was tall, very tall, and thin, dressed in dark clothing. It was facing away from him, towards the fields. Mark slowed down slightly. Maybe someone had broken down? Though he hadn't seen any vehicles, maybe someone needed help? His instinct was to stop, but something about the stillness of the figure, the sheer wrongness of its presence out here, gave him pause. He continued to approach, his speed now maybe 40 miles per hour. He was maybe 100 yards away now. The figure still hadn't moved. It was just standing there, utterly still. He could see now that its clothing seemed old-fashioned, or maybe just dark and nondescript. He couldn't make out details of a face as it was facing away, but the height was striking. Easily over 6 feet, maybe closer to 7, and unnaturally thin. As his truck drew level with the figure, Mark glanced over. He expected it to turn, maybe wave for help, but it didn't. It remained facing the field. He could see its profile now, or what he assumed was its profile. It seemed elongated. The neck seemed too long, the head perhaps too small or strangely shaped. He couldn't be sure in the fleeting moment the headlights passed over it. He drove past. His heart was pounding. That was strange. Really strange. He checked his rear-view mirror. He could see the figure in his mirror, illuminated by his taillights. It was still standing there, still facing the field. It hadn't turned to watch him go. This struck him as even stranger. If it needed help, surely it would turn? Wave? He kept driving, the image of the tall, still figure imprinted on his mind. He glanced in the mirror again. A minute later, the figure was smaller now. Further away, still standing there, facing the field. He shook his head, trying to dismiss it. Just some weirdo, maybe drunk, or on drugs. Yeah, that must be it. Some poor soul having a bad night. He tried to push the image from his mind and focus on the road. He drove for maybe another 5 minutes. The road was still straight, still empty. He was starting to feel a little better, the initial shock wearing off. He was about to take a sip of coffee when he glanced up at the road ahead again, and his breath hitched. There it was again, the figure, standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe a quarter mile ahead, facing away from him, towards the fields. The same tall, thin shape, the same dark clothing. Mark slammed on his brakes, the truck shuddering. He stared, disbelieving. How can it be ahead of him? He hadn't stopped. He hadn't slowed down significantly after passing it the first time. He'd been doing 65 miles per hour. It was impossible, utterly, physically impossible for a person to cover that distance, on foot, and be ahead of him again. Panic began to set in. Cold, clammy fear. He stared at the figure. It was still perfectly still, unmoving. He felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a person. Not a normal person, anyway. He thought about turning around, but the next exit was miles back. And the thought of driving past it again, or worse, having it approach him if he stopped. He couldn't. There it was again, the figure, standing on the shoulder of the road, maybe a quarter mile ahead, facing away from him towards the fields. The same tall, thin shape, the same dark clothing. Mark slammed on his brakes, the truck shuddering violently, the air brakes hissing, the sudden deceleration pushing him forward against the steering wheel. He stared, disbelieving, his eyes wide, fixed on the impossibly reappeared figure. His mind reeled. How? He had just passed it. He had seen it in his rearview mirror, receding into the distance. He had driven at a steady, high speed. There were no turnoffs, no side roads, nothing it could have used to get ahead of him. The land was flat, open fields. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to sprint ahead unseen. It was impossible, utterly, physically impossible, for a person, any person, to cover that distance on foot and be ahead of him again, standing in the exact same posture in the middle of nowhere. Panic began to set in. Cold, clammy fear that started in his gut and spread like icy water through his veins. He stared at the figure. It was still, perfectly still, unmoving, as if it had simply appeared. He felt a wave of nausea, a sudden, dizzying disorientation. This wasn't a person, not a normal person anyway. The thought struck him with the force of a physical blow. What was it? He thought about turning around, slamming the truck into reverse, and getting out of there. But the next exit was miles back, and the thought of driving past it again, the thought of what might happen if he stopped, if he reversed, if he seemed to acknowledge its impossible presence. He couldn't. Every instinct screamed at him to get away, to put distance between himself and that thing on the side of the road. The only way was forward. His hands, slick with sweat, tightened their grip on the steering wheel. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He took a shaky breath, trying to force air into his constricted lungs. He had to drive past it. He had no other choice. He released the brakes and slowly, cautiously, began to move forward again. His eyes were glued to the figure. As he approached, he kept his speed low, maybe 20 miles per hour. He didn't want to rush this. He wanted to see it, to understand, even though he knew deep down there would be no understanding. He was getting closer now. 50 yards, 40 yards, 30. The figure remained motionless, facing the field. He could see the details slightly better now in the glare of his headlights. The clothing was dark, yes, but it seemed to hang strangely, as if on a frame that wasn't quite solid. The height was even more pronounced up close. It towered there, a dark, elongated silhouette against the slightly less dark sky of the horizon. 20 yards, 10 yards. He held his breath. His truck was just a few feet away now, about to draw level. He forced himself to look directly at it as he passed. What he saw, or what he thought he saw in that fleeting moment, would haunt him. As his headlights swept across it, he saw not a face. The head seemed to tilt slightly, just as he was passing, and where a face should have been, there was nothing distinct. A darkness that seemed deeper than the night, a void where features should be. And the profile he had seen before, it seemed to shift, to blur, as if the very form was unstable. The clothing, it didn't seem to be made of fabric. It seemed to be part of the darkness itself, clinging to the impossibly thin frame. He floored the accelerator the moment the truck was past it. The engine roared as he sped away. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror immediately. He focused on the road ahead, driving faster than he should have, his heart pounding, his hands slick, his whole body trembling. He drove like a man possessed, needing to put as much distance as possible between himself and that thing. After several minutes, when the initial surge of adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a deep, lingering dread, he forced himself to check the rearview mirror. He expected to see it there, miles behind, a tiny speck, or perhaps, impossibly, right behind him. The mirror showed only the empty road, stretching back into the darkness. Nothing, absolutely nothing. It was gone, vanished as inexplicably as it had appeared ahead of him. He kept checking, every few seconds, for the next hour, until the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the sky. He saw nothing else unusual, just the empty road, the fields, and eventually the distant lights of the next town. Mark pulled into a truck stop as the sun was rising. He parked, turned off the engine, and just sat there in the silence, his hands still shaking. He felt physically ill. He hadn't imagined it. He couldn't have. He had seen it, driven past it, seen it again, driven past it again. The sheer, impossible reality of it was crushing. He didn't tell anyone the full story immediately. How could he? I saw a 7-foot-tall, impossibly thin figure that teleported ahead of my truck on a deserted highway. He knew how that sounded, like he'd finally cracked from the long hours. But the experience changed him profoundly. He used to love the solitude of night driving. Now the darkness felt menacing, alive. Every distant object on the side of the road sent a jolt of fear through him. Every shadow seemed to stretch and distort. He started avoiding the really remote routes, preferring highways with more traffic, even if it meant longer travel times. He found it difficult to sleep. The image of that dark, faceless form standing in his headlights, flashing behind his eyelids. He eventually cut back on his night driving entirely, switching to day routes, even though it meant less money. He couldn't shake the feeling that the roads, especially the empty ones in the dead of night, belonged to things that weren't meant to be seen, things that defied explanation and logic. He still drives, but he says a part of him is always looking, always scanning the darkness beyond his headlights, terrified that he might once again see that impossible figure standing on the shoulder, waiting in the dead of night. Our third story takes place within the sterile, silent confines of a modern, yet slightly aged, office building after hours. This account comes from Liam, who worked as a night security guard. Liam was a young man, saving up for college, and the night shift paid well. It was supposed to be easy money. Patrol the building, check the doors, monitor the cameras, mostly just sit and study. He wasn't easily spooked. He knew buildings made noises at night. The HVAC system kicking in, the settling of the structure, the wind outside. He was rational. He needed to be, for what he would eventually experience. The building was a 10-story structure in a quiet business park. During the day, it bustled with hundreds of people. At night, it was a tomb, silent, dark, and vast. Liam's shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. The first few weeks were uneventful. He'd do his rounds, grab a coffee, watch the monitors, do some reading. The silence was initially peaceful, a stark contrast to the daytime noise. The first oddity he noticed was minor. He was on his patrol route, checking each floor. He'd gone through the third floor, ensuring all office doors were closed and locked. He moved up to the fourth. About 20 minutes later, he was on the sixth floor, looking down the stairwell, when he thought he heard something faint from below. He paused, listening. Silence. He dismissed it. Probably just the building settling. The next night, something similar happened. He'd locked up the ground floor entrance, double-checking the electronic lock. He went upstairs to the security office on the second floor. A little while later, he checked the camera feed for the ground floor lobby. The main entrance door, which he distinctly remembered locking, was slightly ajar. Just a crack. Not enough for someone to get in, but definitely not fully closed. He felt a prickle of unease. Had he forgotten to push it fully shut? Unlikely. He was meticulous. He went back downstairs and closed it properly. He checked the logs. No one had entered or exited since he started his shift. He shrugged it off. Maybe the lock hadn't engaged fully. Old building quirks. These small things continued. A light left on in an office he knew he'd turned off. A door found slightly open on a floor he'd already patrolled. A faint sound from a distant part of the building that stopped the moment he tried to locate it. Individually, they were easy to explain away. Cumulative, they began to wear on him. The silence of the building started to feel less peaceful and more watchful. About a month into the job, the sounds became more distinct. He was sitting at the security desk on the second floor, doing some reading. It was past 2 a.m. The building was utterly silent. And then he heard it. Footsteps, faint but clear, coming from the floor directly above him. The third floor. Tap, tap, tap. They weren't heavy. They sounded like someone walking slowly, deliberately, across the carpeted office floor. Liam froze, his book forgotten. He strained his ears. Yes, footsteps on the third floor, but there was no one else in the building. His logs confirmed it. The motion sensors on the third floor were inactive. He stood up, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He told himself it was the building, the old pipes, the ventilation system, but it sounded exactly like footsteps. He walked towards the stairwell, his hand on his flashlight. He ascended the stairs quietly, reaching the landing for the third floor. He paused, listening intently. Silence. The footsteps had stopped the moment he reached the floor. He cautiously entered the third floor hallway. Dark. Empty. He swept his flashlight beam down the corridor. Empty offices on either side. He walked slowly down the hall, checking each office door. All closed. All locked. He walked the entire floor, checked the break room, the conference rooms, the restrooms. Nothing. No one. The motion sensor panel showed no activity. It was empty. completely empty. He went back downstairs, feeling foolish, but also deeply unsettled. His rational mind offered explanations. Acoustics, pipes, maybe a rodent? But the sound had been so clear, so much like walking. The footsteps returned the next night, and the night after that, always on the third floor, always starting faintly, then stopping when he went to investigate. Sometimes they sounded like they were pacing. Other times, like someone was shuffling or dragging their feet. It was never loud, never aggressive, but utterly persistent and utterly inexplicable. He started dreading the late hours. The silence of the building, once peaceful, now felt like a heavy blanket, amplifying every tiny sound, making him jump at his own shadow. He found himself constantly checking the camera feeds, scanning the empty hallways, half expecting to see something that shouldn't be there. Then came the whispers. He was on the 5th floor, doing his patrol, walking down a long, dark hallway lined with offices, and he heard it, a faint murmuring, like voices, very far away, just at the edge of audibility. He stopped dead, listening. It seemed to be coming from one of the offices near the end of the hall. He approached the office cautiously. The door was closed. He pressed his ear against it. The murmuring stopped. He waited. Silence. He tried the doorknob. Locked. He shone his flashlight through the small window in the door. The office was empty. Desks, chairs, computers covered with dust covers. No one inside. This was worse than the footsteps. Footsteps could maybe be explained away by the building. Whispers in an empty, locked office? That felt personal. That felt like something trying to be heard. The whispers became another recurring phenomenon. Sometimes on the 5th floor, sometimes the 7th, sometimes the 10th. Always faint, always stopping when he got close. It was as if whatever was making the sounds was playing a game. Always just out of reach. Always just beyond confirmation. The psychological toll began to mount. Liam was exhausted, constantly on edge. He started bringing in extra lights, trying to push back the oppressive darkness of the empty building. He talked to the daytime guards, casually asking if they'd ever experienced anything strange. They laughed, talking about weird noises, but attributing them to the old building. They hadn't spent hours alone in its absolute silence, listening. The climax of his experience came one night around 3:30 a.m. He was sitting at the security desk, trying to focus on his book, but his ears were straining for sounds. The building was silent, deeply, unnervingly silent. And then, from the hallway just outside the security office, on the 2nd floor, where he was sitting, he heard a distinct, sharp tap. His head snapped up. His eyes darted to the doorway. Nothing. Just a dark hallway, stretching away. His heart leaped into his throat. That wasn't from a floor above. That wasn't distant. That was right here. He stood up slowly, his chair scraping loudly in the silence. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight, the beam cutting a swathe through the darkness. He stepped out of the office into the hallway. Empty. He shone the light down the hall to the left. Empty. Down the hall to the right. empty. He felt a wave of adrenaline, quickly followed by pure, unadulterated terror. He was not alone. Whatever was making these sounds, whatever had been moving through the building, was now on his floor. It was close. He took a step back towards the office, his breath coming in ragged gasps. As he did, he heard it again. Not a tap this time, a soft, wet, slithering sound, coming from the end of the hallway, where it turned a corner. Slide, drag, slide. It was slow, deliberate, and utterly unnatural. It sounded like something heavy and damp being dragged across the carpet. He froze, rooted to the spot. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. His flashlight beam was fixed on the corner. The sound continued, slowly approaching the corner. Slide, drag. It was getting closer. He could hear a faint, wet ch sound accompanying it, like something sticky adhering and releasing from the floor. The air in the hallway felt suddenly cold, heavy. He stood there, paralyzed by fear, the slithering sound growing louder, closer to the corner. Any second now, he expected to see something emerge. His mind raced, conjuring images of things that slithered, things that dragged themselves across floors in the dark. Snakes? No. Too heavy. Something without legs. Something wrong. The slithering sound reached the corner. It paused. The ch sound stopped. Silence. A tense, unbearable silence. Liam's heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. He stared at the corner, flashlight beam steady, sweat dripping down his face. Seconds stretched into an eternity. He waited and waited. Nothing emerged. No sound, no movement, just the dark, empty hallway and the oppressive silence. He didn't know how long he stood there. 5 minutes? 10? His legs were trembling. He slowly, carefully took a step back. Then another. He retreated back into the security office, his eyes glued to the hallway entrance. He didn't turn off the light. He didn't sit down. He stood by the desk, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other, ready to dial 911. He stayed like that for the rest of his shift, standing, watching, listening. He heard nothing else. No footsteps, no whispers, no slithering. Just the silence of the building, which now felt less empty and more occupied. When the first daytime guard arrived at 6 a.m., Liam was pale, shaken, and barely coherent. He tried to explain what he'd heard. The guard, a kindly older man, listened patiently, but clearly thought Liam had just had a bad night, maybe fallen asleep and dreamt it. They checked the hallway where Liam had heard the slithering. Nothing. No marks on the carpet. No sign of disturbance. Liam quit that day. He couldn't go back. The thought of being alone in that building in the dark, knowing what might be moving through its empty spaces, was unbearable. The experience left him with a profound and lasting fear of silence, especially in large, empty places at night. He still jumps at unexpected sounds, and sometimes, when he's alone in his apartment late at night, in the deepest quiet, he thinks he can hear, just at the edge of hearing, a faint, wet, slithering sound, reminding him that some things in the dead of night defy explanation, and once they touch you, they never truly leave. Three accounts, three encounters in the dead of night, a persistent tapping, escalating to violent scraping and growling around a home, an impossible figure appearing and reappearing on a desolate highway, unexplained footsteps, whispers, and a chilling slithering sound in an empty building. These stories, shared by those who claim to have lived them, tap into a primal fear that resides deep within us. The fear of the dark, the fear of the unknown, the fear of being alone when something else is present. The dead of night strips away our defenses. The familiar world is cloaked in shadow. Sounds are distorted or amplified, and our minds, deprived of visual input, are left to conjure possibilities that are often far more terrifying than anything the light of day can reveal. Why do these things seem to happen most often in the deepest hours of the night? Is it simply because we are more vulnerable, more susceptible to suggestion, more likely to misinterpret ordinary events when fatigue and fear are our companions? Or is there something else at play? Something that truly awakens when the sun sets? Something that prefers the cloak of absolute darkness? Something that waits for the world to sleep before it makes its presence known? We may never have definitive answers. These stories exist in the liminal space between reality and nightmare, between the explainable and the utterly inexplicable. They serve as unsettling reminders that even in our modern age, armed with logic and technology, there are still corners of the world, and indeed, corners of the night that remain mysterious, terrifying, and perhaps not entirely empty. And consider, just for a moment, that you might not be as alone as you believe. If these accounts from the dead of night resonated with you, if they stirred that ancient unease, then perhaps you understand the fascination with the unexplained. If you appreciate these journeys into the darker corners of true horror, we invite you to join our growing community. Leaving a like on this video signals your engagement and helps us know that these stories are connecting with fellow explorers of the strange. To ensure you don't miss our future deep dives into eerie occurrences and chilling true accounts, please consider subscribing to the channel. And for a notification, the moment we release a new story that might just keep you awake when the world is asleep, be sure to click the notification bell. We are always interested to hear your perspectives. What did you think of these stories? Do you have your own experiences from the dead of night you'd be willing to share? Leave a comment below. Until our next descent into the darkness, stay vigilant and remember, listen closely.